Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's my honor to introduce Maureen Stanton. Maureen has been writing, reading, teaching, and publishing memoir for over 2 decades. Her coming-of-age memoir, Body Leaping Backward, Memoir of a Delinquent Girlhood, released in 2019, won a Maine Literary Award, and was a People magazine Best New Books pick. Her first book, Killer Stuff and Tons of Money, an insider's look at the world of flea markets, antiques, and collecting, won a Massachusetts Book Award, and was a Parade Magazine 12 Great Summer Books selection. Her essays have been widely published in literary journals and anthologies, including the New York Times, Fourth Genre, Creative Nonfiction, and the New England Review, and received awards including Pushcart Prizes, the Iowa Review Award, and the Sewanee Review Award. And she has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Maine Arts Commission, and the MacDowell Colony. She is also a professor of creative writing at UMass Lowell. Here to discuss her methods and her latest memoir, The Murmur of Everything Moving, winner of the Donald Jordan Prize for Literary Excellence, I'm honored and thrilled to introduce Maureen Stanton.
Hey, thank you so much, Todd. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in on this really wonderful night outside, for staying with us for the webinar. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but first I wanted to just give a little more background on myself. I have been teaching memoir for about 20 years, and I've taught memoir writing to senior citizens and to first graders, actually. I currently teach undergraduate students, but I've also taught PhD students at the University of Missouri. So memoir is just my specialty. I read, write, and teach memoir, and I've been doing so for quite some time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'll take questions after. The presentation will be about 20 to 30 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. And if you want to write your questions in the chat box, that would be great. But after the presentation, I'll answer any questions that you have. And if I don't get to your question, you can just find me at UMass Lowell and email me at my UMass Lowell address. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and go to my PowerPoint, which is basically about memoir. And one of the things I wanted to first talk about is why I created this presentation. And that is that I think that memoir is a bit of a misunderstood genre. A lot of people don't really know where the genre of memoir came from. And an example of this is in 2006. Some of you might remember that author James Fry had a memoir on his drug addiction and recovery called A Million Little Pieces. It was an Oprah Book Club pick, and it sold over 3.5 million copies and netted Fry $4.3 million. James Fry said to Oprah, if I was going to write a book that was true and I was going to write a book that was honest, then I was going to have to write about myself in very, very negative ways. After this book came out and was a giant bestseller, the smokinggun.com fact checked some of the things in Fry's book, and they debunked a lot of it. Obviously, memoir is not perfect truth. It's the essential truth, but he had so many fabrications in there that he came under a lot of criticism. One of the things he said was he was involved in a car accident that killed 2 girls in high school. He was not involved at all. The families were quite upset that he actually included that in what was supposed to be a true story. He said he drove drunk, hit a cop, received a 3-year sentence, and a mafia boss and crooked sheriff got him out of the sentence. There's no record of any such incident. And then he said he was in jail for 3 months, and while in jail, he formed a book club with hardened criminals, read War and Peace, Don Quixote, the Brothers Karamazov. But actually, he spent 3 hours in an Ohio town police headquarters just waiting for friends to come pick him up in post bail. The reason this is a problem is that Fry, when he was on Stephen King, said that he was working in the tradition of American writers like Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Kerouac, Bukowski. And King said, well, they were all writing fiction. And this is the key thing. Fry said, at the time of their books being published, the genre of memoir didn't exist. I mean, the genre of memoir is one that's very new, and the boundaries of it had not been established yet. And he said this back, 20 years ago. But I'm here to tell you that memoir is a very long tradition. It actually is outdates. It's a longer tradition than the novel and the short story. The first published memoir is considered St. Augustine's The Confessions, the first book-length Western memoir published in the 4th century. And it began a tradition of memoir as a spiritual journey, confession and redemption, and that spanned about 1,000 years. From confessions, I will now call to mind my past foulness and the carnal corruptions of my soul, reviewing my most wicked ways. One of the things he talks about is stealing peaches from an orchard and having a little dalliance with a woman that he was not married to, and she became pregnant out of wedlock. So part of this tradition also is the book of Marjorie Kemp, published around 1436 or 7. It's considered the earliest autobiography in English. So, and again, it takes part from this redemption, conversion to spirituality or religiosity tradition. And she writes, here beginneth a short treatise and a comfortable for sinful wretches like herself. We also have the life of Saint Teresa de Avila by herself, written in 1562, which actually was a bestseller after Don Quixote by Cervantes in Spain. And again, for the love of our Lord, I beg of everyone who shall read this story of my life to keep in mind how wicked it has been. So this is the religious conversion memoir tradition that really started the memoir tradition. Around the 16th century, we have a memoir by Benvenuto Cellini, who was a sculptor. And he said, all men who have done anything of excellence ought, if they are persons of truth and honesty, to describe their life with their own hand. And this started a newer tradition of memoir, which is the great man memoir. The statesman, soldier, explorer, artist, leader. The tradition was that people who had done something great, and these were mostly men, should record their life for others to have an exemplar to follow. I did research in graduate school with a professor who specialized in autobiography, looking at a WorldCat database starting from the 11th century to, at the time, it was about 2000, and found that about 80% of memoirs and autobiographies were published by men. So here we have only 20% published by women. So that's the great man tradition. Around 1782, we get Confessions again by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but this is not a religious conversion memoir. This is one of the first autobiographies to look at the self, the human self, in all our foibles, in its honesty, and it shocked the 18th century Parisians. I have entered upon a performance, he wrote, which is without example, whose accomplishments will have no imitator. I mean to present my fellow mortals with a man in all the integrity of nature, and this man shall be myself. And then the next sort of stage of memoir writing is people writing themselves into history, and these are slaves' narratives. The very first one is 1789, the interesting narrative of the life of Oladao Equiano or Gustavus Vasa the African. And he wrote at the very bottom, permit me with the greatest deference and respect to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative, the chief design of which will be to excite a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed upon my unfortunate countrymen, the first slave narrative. And then there followed other people who were writing themselves into history. One was William Epps, and there's different spellings of Epps. You can't tell which is the actual one because there's different spellings. And he writes, this was not the only act of injustice which this oppressed nation, the Pequods, suffered at the hands of their white neighbors. That's the first known Native American memoir. So again, unlike James Fry, memoir was not invented 50 years ago. It has a long tradition. Many of you have probably heard of the narrative of life of Frederick Douglass, an African slave written by himself, or maybe the incidents of the life of a slave girl written by Harriet Jacobs, written by herself. Part of the reason why, let me just go back a second. Part of the reason why they have in there written by herself, and we saw that also with William Epps, is because, of course, as many of you probably know, slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write. And often they told their stories to white writers who would literally clean them up. They would actually sanitize the memoirs for the white audiences, because they didn't want to offend their sensibilities with the cruelties that were happening. They didn't think that the white audiences believe those cruelties. So then in the 20th century, I'm moving through history very quickly here, we have the democratization of memoir. You start getting memoirs written by not great men and not necessarily witness narratives, but from ordinary people. You have survivor narratives. Many of you probably have read Night by Elie Wiesel. It's often taught in high school. Survival at Auschwitz by Primo Levi. We have Memoirs by Women, Memories of a Catholic Girlhood by Mary McCarthy in 1957. Multicultural memoirs, The Hunger of Memory by Richard Rodriguez, published in 1982. He was a first generation Mexican American. His parents are Mexican immigrants and farm laborers. He ended up getting a PhD. And his story is about the loss of connection with his family when he elevated himself beyond their abilities to really communicate when he became educated. We have Memoirs of the Poor and Working Class. Many of you might remember Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, which won a National Book Award, and they made a movie out of it, writing about extreme poverty growing up. It's a coming of age memoir. The Liars Club by Mary Carr in 1995 was also a bestseller, growing up with an artist mother and a Texas oilman father. She became a poet and a writer. An Illness and Disability, like Body Remember by Kenny Freese. And we have GLBTQ memoirs. One of the first is Becoming a Man, Half a Life Story by Paul Monet. So this is people writing their own stories, the democratization of memoir, ordinary people writing memoir. So you had a huge surge in memoir in the 2000s, the late 20th century, early 21st century. Sales of memoir increased in 4 years by 400% between 2004 and 2008. And then between 1999 and 2008, about a decade, sales on biography and memoir rose from 170 million to 270 million. And once you started getting this big surge in memoir that started in late 80s, 1990s, and really has continued, you start getting a lot of criticism of memoir. So you have in the quote at the top is a literary agent, Lynn Nesbitt, saying, this memoir craze has eaten away at fiction. People worried that memoir was taking the place of fiction. And then you start getting just a lot of criticism of memoir. Me, Myself, and I. James Wolcott of Vanity Fair wrote an article called Me, Myself, and I. Never have many shared so much of so little. Quite a damning comment on memoir. Dana Gioia, who became head of the NEA for a while and as a poet, was quoted as saying, people are no longer well educated in any general subject. All they have left to write about is themselves. I mean, these are very harsh statements about a tradition which has continued for millennium. A completely self-obsessed therapeutic literature which takes no cognizance of the rest of American society. And then again, William Grimes in the New York Times, he was a dramatist, a playwright. Is there not something to be said about the unexamined life? Finally, at the bottom is another writer for Vanity Fair saying, sappy, ham-fisted, this is a teaching moment memoirs threaten the deforestation of the planet as much as McDonald's does. And finally, Neil Genslinger, this is the last one. This is exactly how the article appeared with memoir and then, the little cross out moir and then just me. A moment of silence, please, for the lost art of shutting up. There was a time when you had to earn the right to draft a memoir by accomplishing something noteworthy. What does that sound like? It sounds like the great man memoir tradition that went on for quite a long time. But then came our current age of oversharing, a sea of people you've never heard of, writing uninterestingly about the unexceptional, apparently not realizing how commonplace their little wrinkle is, an absurdly bloated genre. This is not, the criticism of memoir is not necessarily new. And you see at the bottom of the screen in 1827, John Lockhart, who was the biographer of Sir Walter Scott, complained about the mania for this garbage of confessions and recollections and reminiscences. But I have a different perspective on that. I think that memoir has quite a valuable place in our culture, our literary culture, and our society as a whole. And so I want to talk about why we write and read memoir. One of the things that memoir can do is witness testimony. It adds to the historical records. Oops, sorry about that. Fills holes that are not in the historical record about the socio-political impacts on individuals. So that's slave narratives, memoirs by indigenous people, war and genocide narratives, and narratives of political oppression and persecution. And this is a little clip from Marjane Satrapi's wonderful memoir, called Persepolis, published in 2000. And she has a follow-up called Persepolis 2, which is a graphic memoir about coming of age during the Islamic revolution, the fall of Iran. And you can see the story here is she stopped. There were guardians of the revolution in the women's branch who had been added in 1982 to arrest women who were improperly veiled. And they say, what do I see here? Michael Jackson, that symbol of decadence. And it says, no, it's Malcolm X, the leader of Black Muslims in America. You know, don't give me that. It's Michael Jackson. Who? I don't know him. So the whole story is about how her life radically shifted as a girl, as an adolescent girl, when the Muslim takeover, basically the revolution in Iran, went from a secular society to a Muslim, fundamentalist Muslim society. One of the really important things that memoir can do is testify. It can break silence, expose wrongdoing. A great example of this is a book by Richard Hoffman, who is a Boston-based writer, and it's called Half the House. And Richard Hoffman grew up in a family with two brothers who had cerebral palsy. So his parents were very occupied taking care of his brothers. And he was befriended by a fatherly baseball coach who turns out to have sexually abused him for many years. So Richard Hoffman wrote about this, and he used his coach's real name. When the book came out, there was a parent who noticed that her son was being, who was the sort of pet of the coach, the sort of boy that, you know, was always hanging around. And again, what happened was eventually, his name was Tom Feifel. He was convicted, and it turns out that he had sexually abused 400 boys during his nearly 4 decades of coaching. And so Richard Hoffman bravely wrote about this. And it's very, very important testimony that helped save other boys from being molested by this person and having justice. Another example is the memoirs by survivors of the Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge, beginning in April 75. In 3 years and 8 months. I think many of you know about that because of the large Cambodian population in this area of Chelmsford and Lowell. 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of the Khmer Rouge, 1.7 million Cambodians were executed or died of starvation or forced labor or disease. These 3 books, I did a review of these 3 books, are all quite wonderful. They're very different. The Stones Cry Out is a more poetic take on the story. Chenrithi hymns When Broken Glass Floats wisely adds political context to her story. And then Lao Ang's book, First They Killed My Father, A Daughter of Cambodia, makes the very important point that the reason why these memoirs are written by women is because the men were all killed. They first killed the men. So these memoirs are quite important. We cannot, the quote at the bottom by Jenny Edkins, who wrote a book called Trauma and the Memory of Politics, says, as long as memories are organized in a framework of nations and states, there will always be attempts to recount even genocides and famines as triumphs and their victims as having sacrificed their lives for future generations. So I think the whole question is, who gets to tell the story? And often we get a more authentic and detailed account of stories that are historically important by the memoirs, the diaries, the personal writings of individual, ordinary people. We also read and write memoir to make history personal. Writing your memoir can capture a moment in history through an individual lens. My students now often are writing about times of the pandemic. I don't think they quite know when they're writing sort of intuitively that they're capturing a larger historical moment of what it's like to, say, graduate high school and have to drive up to a window of a school to pick up your diploma because you can't be around people, and the effect that that had on people. So they are actually writing their personal stories, but they're making that personal story connected to the historical moment of a global pandemic. Some of you might know Jill Lepore, the historian that often writes for the New Yorker. When history books are wrong, they can be miserably, badly, ridiculously wrong. And so we turn to memoirs. Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody is a really quite wonderful book that was published around 1968. This is her at a lunch counter sit-in in Mississippi. We also read and write memoir to visit unknown territory. You've all heard that saying, walk a mile in someone's shoes to get to know them. Memoir can transport readers into other people's lives. It can educate us. It can break down barriers. It can help us understand. I personally think that memoir expands our world. It's expanded my world and my knowledge. Some of these books that are quite good is our Travels with Lisbeth by Lars Einar. He actually was homeless for a couple of years. He has an English degree, but because he didn't have family and he lost his job, he fell into being homeless. One of his chapters that I like to teach is on dumpster diving, and he actually gives a primer on the things you should and shouldn't look for when you're dumpster diving. Jarhead is a great memoir on military service in the first Gulf War. Waist High in the World is by Nancy Mears, who had multiple sclerosis. So what it's like to be seeing people from a wheelchair where you're only seeing people at a waist high level. It gives us a real insider perspective of what it's like. We can empathize and we can understand vicariously what it might be like to have that multiple sclerosis or be handicapped. Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life is one of my favorite by William Finnegan. It was a National Book Award winner. He dropped out of college and traveled around the world, just on pennies, trying to find the next big wave to surf. And the writing is quite beautiful. He's a New Yorker writer, and it's the reason I love this book so much. It's not a trauma memoir. It's not a historical memoir, but it's a memoir that takes me in a place that I would never be. I would never be in Fiji surfing big waves. But here he wrote so beautifully about it that you really felt like you were there. So it's just a really wonderful experience to be immersed in his book. Another reason to read and write memoirs for psychological exploration, and this is to examine the forces that shape ourselves and the development of our own consciousness. A lot of coming of age memoirs do this. American Girlhood is quite famous memoir by Annie Dillard. Ordinary Childhood in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Many of you know probably work by Andre Dubus III, my colleague at UMass Lowell. His memoir called Townie is a coming of age memoir as well. And he wrote about male violence in a way that I think is quite honest. And I haven't really seen such honest approach to male violence, to fighting, basically. And how he moved past that, why he got into that, and how he moved past that. Moments of Being by Virginia Woolf is really exploring the moments of consciousness, what it means to be an alive, awake, thinking person. We also read memoir to share experience and to explore universal themes. Michel de Montaigne, who coined the term essay and actually started the form of essay writing, which is a form of creative nonfiction along with memoir, wrote, within each man or within each human is the stamp of all mankind or humankind. And what this means is that we are all individual, we are completely unique, but there's a blueprint of humanity within us. So Fierce Attachments by Vivian Gornick is another coming of age memoir where she had to unlearn the lessons of her mother in oppressed 1950s Brooklyn, New York. Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, Boston-based writer Nick Flynn, searching for his father who left the family when Flynn was an infant, finding out that his father was an alcoholic, and then serendipitously or not, meeting his father when his father came into a homeless shelter in Boston where Nick was actually working. And of course, James Baldwin, quite famously, Notes of a Native Son, a beautiful book, and the Taylor essay I teach in my classes. It is about being a Black man in 1950s, 60s, in Harlem, New York, and it's brilliant writing. So the experiences that people want to share are identity, coming of age, illness, loss, and grief, rites of passage, redemption, love and relationships, spiritual journeys, conflict and survival, and family memoirs. Those are the universal underlying stories that gird the sort of personal, more idiosyncratic stories that people tell in memoir. So this is a memoir that I particularly like. It's called A New England Girlhood by Lucy Larcombe, written in 1889. And she was a mill girl. She worked in the textile mills in the Merrimack Valley, but she was also a poet. And she has these wonderful quotes about memoir, which are really contradict the kind of criticism of memoir. She says, there may be more egotism in withdrawing mysteriously into oneself than in frankly unfolding one's life story. Memoir is a very intimate form. You feel when someone makes themselves vulnerable on the page, readers tend to open themselves up to that. And she wrote, the relationship between writer and reader may be, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button, maybe and often does not become that of mutual friendship, and often does become that of mutual friendship. And friends naturally like to know each other in a neighborly way. Um, so the commonest personal history has value when is looked at as part of one infinite life. Again, we are all part of something larger, even though we are completely individual. And a really good memoirs layer both those stories in. The best memoirs allow us to understand each other's lives and stories, nurturing our sense of empathy. Ian McEwan, the novelist, has this just wonderful quote: imagining what it is like to be someone other than yourself is at the core of our humanity. It is the essence of our humanity. It is the essence of compassion and is the beginning of morality. So again, memoir has a really important place in helping us learn about each other, expanding our worlds, expanding our knowledge, and helping us learn empathy for people who have different experiences than we do. So what makes a great memoir? Vivian Gornick, who wrote Fierce Attachments, which I mentioned earlier, also wrote a book on memoir called The Situation and the Story. And she wrote, a memoir is a work of sustained narrative prose controlled by an idea of the self, under obligation to lift from the raw material of life a tale that will shape experience, transform event, and deliver wisdom. So memoir is not just telling the story, it's looking for meaning in that story. And she actually says, this is kind of astonishing, truth in memoir is achieved not through a recital of actual events. And it's interesting because I was on a radio interview for my book that just came out a few weeks back. And the radio host actually said to me, well, isn't it just telling what already happened? Does memoir actually take any skill or anything? Isn't it just writing what you already know? And that couldn't be further from the truth. It's not just reciting events. The truth in memoir is achieved, Vivian Gornick writes, when the reader comes to believe that the writer is working hard to engage with the experience at hand. And what happened to the writer is not what matters, she says. What matters is the large sense that the writer is able to make of what happened. So we all have, so, for example, I get a lot of, with freshman writers, they first loss in life might be their pet or their grandparent. And I get a lot of those stories. So, yeah, everybody has lost in that way. Everybody has done this or that. What makes your story important? It's not the recital of actual events, because we've all had many of those or share those events, but it's about how that event has affected you and shaped you, the kind of sense that you as a writer are trying to make out of that. So what makes for a very good memoir is honesty. The writer's intent is to honestly examine the experience, not self-aggrandize, make yourself look better, not for revenge against someone who might have harmed you, not for therapy. I mean, I think memoir writing is therapeutic. And in fact, life writing is used with people who suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, especially veterans, and it does help. But you have to then shape that therapeutic outpouring of memoir into literary art, and not to make money. And this is where I come back to James Fry, because the story is that he wrote a novel and it, some true parts, and then he embellished quite a lot and made things up. But it didn't sell because it wasn't very good. It's not very good writing, and it still is not very good writing. And so his agent said to him, "Why not sell it as memoir?" Because memoir was very hot category then. It was sort of this craze of memoir. And he just did, and he didn't bother changing anything. So it was just a fiction to begin with, and not a very good fiction, and not a very good memoir. And he wasn't honest, and that, what he was found out with that. Memoir has reflection. The narrative moves beyond describing events to interrogate those memories and experiences. The quality, it has the hallmarks of literary art. It's great writing. There's wonderful novels and brilliant novels, and there's wonderful novels and brilliant memoirs, and there's bad fiction and bad memoir. It's just, you want to try to have that great writing, like William Finnegan's Barbarian Days. The writing is what makes readers feel transported into a world they might never experience big wave surfing. But to me, that's the true sort of sign of great writing, is that I don't have any former interest in this subject, but reading this book, I'm enthralled with it, and it's because of the great writing. Personal and universal, and this is very important. It pairs again that idiosyncratic personal story with that archetypical universal story. So it's a coming of age. Memoirs are very popular because we all have come of age. It's something we all have to go through. There are certain milestones and hallmarks of coming of age. You have to separate from your parents. You have to figure out who you are, what your values are, who your friends are, who you love. And so those things manifest individually in our lives in very idiosyncratic ways. But the universal is the coming of age experience, and the personal is your individual detailed story. So I'll just talk briefly about my recent memoir, and then we'll open it up for some questions. I wrote this memoir and the memoir is about taking care of my boyfriend who was diagnosed with cancer when he was 29. I was 25 at the time, and he went in the hospital for back pain in the morning, and by later that day he was on the oncology ward, and within a few days he was told he had just weeks or months to live. So during this period of him being ill, our love really changed. And so I wanted to examine that larger question. What does it mean to love somebody? What do we owe people we love? How do we treat people we love? How does love change during certain challenges or under certain challenges? And I also wrote to share the experience, what it means to be a caregiver. When I was going through that experience, I did not find many books about caregivers. And even now, there are a lot of caregivers out there, more women than men, not the parental caregiving, that's different, but caring for elderly parents, caring for spouses, caring for anyone who has illness or needs particular help from somebody else that the healthcare system doesn't cover. And there's lots of caregivers out there, but the stories are not really written from the caregiver perspective. So I wanted to really show that experience of what the caregiver goes through. I wanted to examine a milestone. I was a young woman. I was just out of college. I didn't know what my life was going to be, what choices I was making. I made a choice to move to the Midwest with this man that I fell in love with, but I was still asking, who was I? And then during the time that the 18 months that he did live, that I cared for him, I was questioning, and I still question, did I do the right thing? Pushing him for experimental treatments, was that the right thing? All the things that I did at the time when I was a young woman, taking care of someone and facing mortality at an age when most people don't face mortality of their spouse at that age. And it was really just an examination of that. And I wanted to understand the impact. How did the experience change me? How do I carry it still? So the question that often in memoirs, why should we care? Why should we care about your story? And this is a little bit of the echo of the criticism, oh, me, myself, and I, why should we care? And I think we should care, obviously. But the thing that the writer must do is bridge the personal and the universal. And you do that, again, through that honest examination of experience. And the two of the reviews that I put of my book were very satisfying to me because it showed that they recognized the work that I did to not just tell my story, but to enlarge the story to more universal ideals. So reader's favorite said Stanton's interactions with Steve's family bring to light the rich canvas of relationships that shape our understanding of ourselves and each other. And Kirkus wrote, she definitely connects her story to universal experiences from the first stages of infatuation and passionate love to the excruciating pain and confusion that accompanies the death of a partner. So these are just people recognizing that the story moves beyond just a telling of the events. So I will stop the screen sharing and answer questions. Let me just grab the stop sharing. And I can't see you, so I'm going to go to the chat. So I can't see you, so I can't call on people in particular, but I will see if there are questions. Okay, so create a list of the memoirs presented tonight. So this, I can, if you want to write to me my email, I'll put that in here. I can write that list. But this, I believe that this will be recorded and people can listen to it. Also, I post all my reading and my reviews on Goodreads. And so if you actually are on Goodreads or you want to just jump on Goodreads and you look at, mostly I read memoir. I read fiction, but I mostly read probably 80% memoir and nonfiction. So essay collections, literary journalism. And I'm happy, if you look there, you'll see whatever 5-star review is obviously a review that I recommend. So the question is, how long did it take to write my story as a caregiver? And this is for this book is I had an unusual journey with this book, and that is that I wrote it many years ago. I wrote it over 20 years ago, and I sort of just kept coming back to it. And only recently was it accepted for publication. But it wasn't didn't mean I was writing it for 20 years. I wrote it while I was in graduate school. I earned an MFA in nonfiction writing from Ohio State, and I wrote it the first draft in about a year. But I did have time to write every single day. And then it took me a while to shape it. So maybe a couple of years after that, shaping it. And then again, every time I sort of tried to send it out in the world, I looked at it again. And the very last time was 2 years ago. I sent it to this contest, the Donald Jordan contest, and it won. But that was the last time I looked at it. And I actually trimmed a lot of stuff out of it that I could finally see was superfluous. So it wasn't any kind of direct process. It was kind of a long process over time. I put the book away. I worked on another book that was published. Then I picked this up. Then I worked on my second book and that was published. And then I looked at this again. Okay, so I can go back to that slide in a second. Black Like Me, a memoir. That's a really interesting question. It purports to be a memoir. It's more of I would call it more literary journalism, as sort of immersion journalism. If you know much about literary journalism, which is another American form, basically, only about 120, 25 years old, you have a lot of journalists immersing themselves into a subculture or an experience in order to tell that experience. So in Black Like Me, I can't remember the name of the author. I remember reading that decades ago, really, when I was in high school. He put some kind of dye in the system to make himself Black. He was a white man and traveled in the South to experience what it was like to be Black. And obviously that's very problematic because we have plenty of Black people who can tell us their experience. We don't need a white person to be Black to tell us that. It reminds me of, I think there was a famous model, I think probably Naomi Campbell, don't quote me on that. She put on a fat suit and walked around to see what it was like to be fat. To me, that's just, it's a little exploitative. I mean, back in the 50s, maybe it was excusable, but now you wouldn't do that. You can certainly immerse yourself, and journalists do, into a subculture. And in fact, in my first book, I immersed myself with an antiques dealer who was an itinerant dealer. And I just followed him around, and I didn't pretend to be an antique dealer, but I recorded everything as if for 8 years intermittently to get that really authentic experience of his life. And that's immersion journalism. So I would call Black Like Me immersion journalism. Let me just go back to some question. So the other books I've written were Killer Stuff and Tons of Money. That's the antiques book, immersion journalism. My first memoir was called Body Leaping Backward. It's a coming of age memoir. And I was always fascinated by growing up in Walpole, Massachusetts, which in the 70s was the home of the only maximum security prison in the state. And what I noticed was there was a lot of things going on with the adolescents and youth in Walpole that were basically did not suffer the consequences of the increasingly Hispanic and Black younger population in Walpole Prison for these same crimes. So let me just go back. So then my third book is this one that recently came out about a caregiver. So the question is, let's just go back. The second book was Body Leaping Backward. Okay, so my wife observes there's a lot of women's memoirs seem to be from women who delude themselves about the relationships. Priscilla Presley and Melania Trump come to mind. I don't really read celebrity memoirs just because they're not very well written. But I think that those celebrity memoirs have a different goal. I think the goal partly is maybe promotion, sales, obviously, taking advantage of fame. Some of them are probably good. I think there's some memoirs by famous people like Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen. Those are quite good. They're well written and they're honest. But I think probably Priscilla Presley and Melania Trump, I wouldn't trust that those would actually be, honest, because if you're going to be really honest, you are going to show a side of yourself that might not be exactly flattering. So that's what I would say with that. Let me just go to, do you feel the need to protect the characters by changing names? That is a great question. Oh, thank you for John Howard Griffin wrote Black Like Me. Thank you for noting that. Yes, I do think it's very important to protect people's privacy. This is something that I talk about with my students. It comes up in every class. And that is, you have a right to tell your story. And obviously, your story touches other people, your parents, your siblings, but you really should try to protect other people's privacy. So in my memoirs, I changed the names of people, except for my family, because they gave me permission to use their names, of other people. So, for example, my boyfriend Steve, who died, I didn't change his name, but I changed the name of his children. He had children from a previous marriage, and I changed the name of his siblings. I also changed their identifying characteristics like hair color, how they look. I didn't put in specific locations. Those are the three things you should change if you want to protect someone's privacy. Name, identifying characteristics of their physical identity, and location. You can be sued for invasion of privacy. There's a writer called Augustin Burroughs. He's written 4 or 5 memoirs. One of them was quite famous, called Running with Scissors. Because it became so famous and a bestseller, his adoptive people knew about it, and his adoptive family read it. They were cast in an unflattering light. And even if something is true, with invasion of privacy, you can be sued for casting someone, for basically harming someone in their current life. If they're recognized in their current life and they're cast in an unflattering light, even if it's true, that's invasion of privacy. So I do protect my characters. You don't have to protect people that are deceased. The deceased cannot be defamed. But if you want to keep your family members, sometimes you'll even change the names of your family members. It really depends on your story. For my book, Body Leaping Backward, I gave my manuscript to all of my 6 siblings, and I asked them, change anything you're uncomfortable with. And they didn't change anything. So I was very, very fortunate that they were very supportive. But there's a book that was just recently published called Permission by Elisa Altman. It just came out a couple of months ago. And she writes about the permission you should have feel to write your own story. However, in her story, she wrote about her father's mother, so her grandmother, and her great aunt, so her father's sister, no longer speaks to her because she didn't want that story to come out. So there is that risk, and I think each writer has to address that risk on their own terms. What I would say to writers who are writing their memoir, when you're writing the book, pretend that no one's going to read it, so you can be very honest on the page. And as you get closer to possibly sending it out for publication, that's the time to think about what you might need to do to protect people's privacy. So I'm going to just scroll down a little bit. So John Howard Griffin in 1961 wrote Black Like Me. My experience with editors who have suggestions, I have finished a first draft memoir and looking for next steps. This is Danny Zemer. This is a long question. If you want to email me at my email, I can sort of talk to you personally about that. But I do have a different experience with editors. My editor for Body Leaping Backward just was hands off. She was wonderful. She just said, just show me the manuscript when you're ready and we'll go through it. She didn't stomp all over it or ask for a lot of changes. My editor for Killer Stuff and Tons of Money wanted to see the first 3 chapters, and I knew that he had a slightly different vision for the book. And I was afraid that he was going to, I guess, really direct me in a direction I didn't want to go to. So even though he asked for 3 chapters, I didn't give him anything till I finished the first draft. I wanted to preserve my vision of the book. So editors are all different. Most editors save you. And I have to say, they save you from typos, they save you from mistakes, they save you from purple prose, from being, from basically indulging yourself with your, the beauty of your language, although it's not serving the narrative. So I think editors are quite valuable, but they all have a different style of writing, of editing your book. I prefer the more hands-off approach, actually. I'm actually reading Sir Patrick Stewart's memoir, wonderful. And such a wonderful gift to us who love him so much. And that's great. I love recommendations. There was a memoir by Andre Agassi called Open. I thought it was fantastic. I thought Andre Agassi was not only a fantastic tennis player, but also a fantastic writer. And then I found out years later it was written by a different writer. It was ghost written, actually, by a writer called, what is it? He wrote The Tender Bar, oh gosh, now I'm forgetting. The Tender Bar, which they made a movie out of. Sorry, I'm forgetting his name. But this wonderful writer ghost wrote Andre Agassi's book. So I'm wondering with Sir Patrick Stewart if he wrote it, if he had a ghostwriter or help writing. There's a memoir called Believe, I think it's called Believe. It's by Diana Nyad, the swimmer who swam from Florida to Cuba and set the record doing that. She actually wrote her own memoir. She was an English major, and it's quite well written. So I'm not saying that celebrities are not also good writers, but a lot of celebrity writers might have a ghostwriter, and you may not know. The writer who wrote Tender Bars, Jay Moringer, and he wrote on Agassi's Open, which both were very well written. Ann Patchett's essay collections. So essay collections, what I teach is creative nonfiction, and under the umbrella of creative nonfiction, you have essays, you have memoir, and you have literary journalism. They are all creative, and they all nonfiction true stories. Memoir privileges memories. It's very experiential. There's lots of scenes. There's lots of recreated moments and scenes. Essays I think of more as think pieces. They're more intellectual. They might be engaging more with ideas. And literary journalism is storytelling in the nonfiction way, but the subject is often not the writer. And that is like my first book, Killer Stuff and Tons of Money. So those essay collections, and again, there's crossover. You might have a memoir that has a very reflective, more thinky, essayistic style. You might have an essay that's a short piece that has a little scene in it that's memoir-ish. But the distinctions are generally memoir, ideas or experience ideas, and other people's stories that nonfiction writers are telling. I Am Not Your Negro. Was this what you mentioned as James Baldwin? Notes of a Native Son is James Baldwin's memoir. And actually that could be considered a collection of essays. There's a shorter piece called Notes of a Native Son, the same as the title. And it really deals with this idea of hate, how hate destroys. Even his own hate for white people, his hate for his father was destroying him. And of course, the hatred of Black people and racism was also destroying him. So he's dealing with an idea, but it's also very storied. There's lots of scenes in there. It's simply stunning. I teach it. I've been teaching it for 20 years, and every time I read it, I'm amazed. So it's the sign of a great writing is that you can read it again and again, and you can have that feeling of being transported, being educated, things being illuminated, and just being astonished by the wonderful writing. And Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin is certainly one of those pieces in that class. So a starting point for a memoir, that's a really good question. A lot of people think that memoir, now there's a lot of contemporary memoirs that are fragmented, that start somewhere else, in the story. I feel like when you're writing a first draft, I think you just write it write it as it happened. Don't worry about structure. Don't worry about where do I start? It's such a big story. I don't know where to start. When I wrote my first memoir in graduate school, I didn't know how to write memoir. My advisor, who is a writer named Bill Rohrbach, he said, you should write the story of Steve as a memoir. And I said, I don't know how to write memoir. And he said, just write me a letter that says, Dear Bill, this is what happened. And that's what I did. I just wrote, Dear Bill, this is what happened. And it just kind of spilled out of me. Moving things around for story comes later. The first thing you want to do in memoir is get your story out, because when you're writing memoir, you are going to re-experience the things. If you really drop down vertically into your past, into past experience, you're going to experience those memories with the emotion that is attached to them. When I wrote my memoir about Steve and taking care of him, the first draft, I cried every day as I was writing it, just sobbing at my keyboard. But once the story was out, I had the distance from it, and I was able to manipulate it as a writer and say, I need to start in a more dynamic place. I need to have more scenes of this. But that did not come until after I wrote the whole first draft, just regurgitating what happened, just letting it intuitively come out of me. Okay, so someone says, I very much enjoyed Seldom Disappointed by Tony Hillerman, autobiographical. However, I believe many pages were as you outlined on one of your slides. Okay, I can show the slide again, but I'll have to share my screen again. So let me just do that after. I'm going to write myself a note. The psychological exploration. I will show that. I will absolutely show that. What did you find most difficult about capturing your experience on the page? Was it hard to be authentic? Was it a challenge to figure out what to include and edit out? I can sometimes get stymied when I consider what I've written with an eventual reader in mind. Um, yeah, every memoir has to have a selection principle. If you write everything that happened, first of all, it might be boring. It might not flow as a story. There is that point of writing where you have to think about the reader and shape the narrative. So, for example, for Body Leaping Backward, writing about my teenage years, I had so much stuff in there. I had childhood memories, funny stuff, happy stuff, then the sad stuff where I kind of went off the rails and, got involved in drugs and that kind of thing. And so it took me a while to figure out what is my story here. And the story was about a moral education. And that's where the prison came in. The prison was, Walpole Prison was kind of a metaphor for the whole story of good and bad. So once I had that theme, that thematic through line of the book, I was able to cut and keep passages as long as they related to that theme. So things about growing up Catholic and going to church and confession, learning what was good and bad, the lessons my parents taught me, lessons in school. And so this whole thing led to my being raised as a moral person, as a Catholic girl, as a good girl, and then going off the rails and doing things that were against the law, etc. How did that happen? So once I figured out what my underlying theme was, I was able to say, okay, that doesn't belong, this doesn't belong. With my memoir, recent memoir about taking care of my boyfriend, excuse me, I first thought it was an illness memoir. I thought, oh, the illness is the interesting thing. And it took me quite a while to realize, no, it's really about love. It's a love story. And it's because our love changed, because right before he was sick, he was diagnosed, we had broken up, and I went back and took care of him. But our love changed because we had this young, youthful, passionate relationship. And then all of a sudden we could no longer have a physical relationship. So how did that change who we were to each other? And it took me a while to figure out it was not really an illness narrative. It was, and not really so much a caregiving narrative, although that's part of it. It was really a love story. So I just think that you come to what your thematic through line is and what you're really writing about through the writing. And it's not always there at first. And you have to kind of trust and you have to keep writing. And then eventually you'll have this moment like, okay, this is what I'm writing about. I see this a lot with my students, and I often can read their pieces and I say to them, I think you're writing about this. And they're just like, oh, okay. They didn't know, but now they see it and then they can actually shape it. So I think you have to trust your intuition when you're writing intuitively. All right, so that's looks like uh, okay. I'm considering taking a lot of the focus on her out. So this is someone writing about an abusive step parent. Look, I would say don't decide that yet. Take your memoir through all the stages, the first draft and later drafts. And when you really are ready to think that it's ready to go out into the world, think about that and say, do I need this in the story? Is it essential to the story? There's a book by Sue Williams Silverman called Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You. And it's about her father sexually abusing her from the time she was 3 till she was 18. Her father was a very high-ranking diplomat for the US government. They were very wealthy. Um, she managed to write about this, and for her to bravely break that taboo and write about it, I think is very important. But she put very little in about what actually happened between her and her father. A little goes a long way. And more of the book was about how she changed because of that, how she was at school, how she was later in relationships with boys. And that just a tiny bit of the actual, uh, sexual abuse was there to show the extent of what happened. It served emblematically for the whole experience. And she didn't have to sort of violate her own privacy in that case. So I think that, Danny, again, email me at umslowell and I can sort of walk you through that a little bit more since you do have a draft of your memoir. Because we do want to break these taboos and talk about family experiences, domestic violence, abuse. We have to talk about it. If you don't expose it, it's going to stay taboo. It's going to stay behind the scenes. So yeah, I'll share my email address. I'm going to go back to that slide again. You can find me my website, and there's a contact page there. You can find me at UMass Lowell. And let me go back to sharing real quickly and get to that psychological screen. Let's see what happened to the slideshow share. Let's see. All right, PowerPoint. Okay, so let me go to the psychological share experience, psychological exploration. Is this the screen that, I'm just gonna look at the chat. Is this the screen that you wanted, the psychological exploration? Hang on a second. Now that I'm sharing, I can't see the chat. So I'm gonna share the screen and then, let's see. Sorry, I can't get to the chat doing this for some reason. So I will stop sharing. And hopefully that was the screen that someone had wanted. So thank you for all your comments and thank you for the questions after this. Okay, let me go back to share again. Hang on a sec. Okay. And share. And so psychological exploration, sharing experience. Okay, so these are the experiences that are the universal stories of memoir: identity, coming of age, illness, loss, grief, rites of passage. That can be marriage, it can be travel, redemption, love and relationships, obviously, spiritual journeys, again, conflict and survival, and family. One thing to note is that some people, you can write many memoirs. I have written 2. Danny Shapiro has written 5 memoirs. They're all good, actually. Mary Carr, who wrote The Liars Club, which was a bestseller, has written 3 memoirs. Cherry is her memoir of teenage years, and then Lit is her memoir of overcoming alcohol addiction, and really it's a conversion memoir, finding Christianity in her 50s, I believe. So let me go back to the chat. Can I write a memoir beginning of my retirement years? Of course. Yeah, you can write a memoir of any time. The difference between memoir and autobiography is that a memoir covers a short period of time. So for example, my coming of age memoir was 3 years, basically. The memoir of caring for Steve was about 5 years of my life. An autobiography traditionally is that format where it's like, I was born, and then my grandparents, and then you cover your whole life from birth to whatever age you are at the writing. I do teach classes online through UMass Lowell. I teach a class in Introduction to Creative Writing, but that covers poetry and fiction. And I teach it's called Creative Nonfiction 1. But mostly, even though it's creative nonfiction, most people are writing memoirs in that. And it's through UMass Lowell's GPS or continuing ed. I sometimes teach workshops for the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. I live up here in Maine. And so that's pretty much, the teaching that I do. Just want to make sure there's not any more questions. Okay. So yeah, so you can, if you go to UMass Lowell Continuing Education, I usually teach, in fact, I'm teaching an online class in the fall. You do have to pay, but actually there's a really good, I'm just going to write here, Grub Street Center in Boston. It's a center for writing. They have in-person and online classes. They have weekend classes. They have 8-week classes. There are tons of classes, many in memoir writing, and many with all good writers. They're all wonderfully published writers, good writers, and they have really dozens and dozens of workshops. Again, some of them are just like an afternoon. Some of them might be an 8-week class. And they can be online, they can be in person. Okay, someone says I can't see what you wrote. I can't see messages. I'm not sure why. I don't think that's my end of it. I think it might be Chelmsford. I can't see. So accessing my email, you can just look me up at UMass Lowell. If you look up Maureen Stanton UMass Lowell, you will come to my faculty page. My email will be on there. Or if you go to my website, which is maureenstantonwriter.com, there's a contact page and you can write to me through the contact page. But my email is Maureen_Stanton@uml.edu. So your outline is on a theme. This is Cindy with the plan to write about various points of your life. I think that can really work. You can write about various points of your life, especially if they are tied together with a sort of a theme. Again, yeah, I think you can absolutely do that. And people are writing people are bringing to the memoir form a lot of creative structures, fragmented memoirs, diary memoirs, memoirs that are reverse chronology. Yeah, I'm sorry that some people are not seeing what I wrote, I'm not sure why that is. I'm typing my email in again. It's Maureen_Stanton@uml.edu. I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming, for everybody for asking great questions. I expect I'll hear from some of you through the email. But again, there's lots of resources out there. Okay, so the library can write, but I can't. It could be the way they set up the webinar, so I'm very sorry about that. And thank you all again. I really, really appreciate you tuning in. It's a beautiful night out, and here you are tuning into the webinar, so I appreciate that. And yeah, thank you all so much. Again, if you have other questions that I haven't answered, feel free to shoot me an email. UMass Lowell, Maureen Stanton, you'll find me. Your chats are directed at hosts and panelists. Yeah, okay. I don't even know what that means, but thanks for clarifying. All right, so I'm going to sign off since that's the end of the questions. And again, thanks everybody for attending. I really appreciate it, and hope to hear from some of you through my email. So I will put a list, I'll give a list of, again, this will be recorded and you can revisit this, but I will send a list to Chelmsford Library and possibly they can post that of the memoirs that I mentioned. And if you email me, I can certainly do that as well. So thank you all and good night to everybody.